the blood oath, the pact, becomes such a key element of that, and you see it in later magical traditions, and in fact the polytheistic religions of the world. There were many of them, particularly early on, even if they lost the practice, many of them literally had blood at the center of their ritual practice, and that often involves blood sacrifice from humans. Now, that could be non-lethal. There are certainly examples of this the world over of bloodletting as blood sacrifice, but not infrequently it was actually the practice of human sacrifice, whether that was of adult supplicants or children, which unfortunately continues to this day, although under a sort of naturalized facade.
Like abortions?
Well, yes, exactly. And all you have to do is look at the statistics, and it's very clear that the cult of Moloch is still very, very much alive in that particular incarnation.
Aloha and welcome to another show, guys. I'm beyond excited to introduce my special guest today, Dr. Judd Burton. Dr. Burton is an accomplished scholar whose expertise spans anthropology, Bible studies, ancient history, and esoteric subjects that most people don't dare explore. His work delves deep into the mysteries of the spiritual realm, ancient giants, the Nephilims, witchcraft, and even vampirism. Yes, you heard that right. And not only is this going to be an incredible conversation, but today marks a huge milestone for the show, our 100th episode. I want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for being part of this journey. Your support, whether through subscribing, reviewing, or sharing, has made this possible. And I truly couldn't have done it without you guys. Now, for this special episode, I couldn't think of a more fitting guest than Dr. Burton. And we are going to dive deep into the world of vampirism, uncovering the ancient lore and spiritual significance behind these mysterious creatures. Dr. Burton has spent decades connecting the dots between ancient civilizations, Bible accounts, hidden spiritual realms, and trust me, you don't want to miss this. Before we jump into this incredible conversation, don't forget to subscribe, review, share the podcast. And you can follow me on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, and wherever you listen to your podcast. And for those of you who want more exclusive content and early access to episodes ad-free, you can find me on Patreon as well. I also want to remind you to visit my website, sensiblehippie.com, where I explore a wide range of topics from alternative health, wellness, and deep dives into spiritual topics that don't always make it into the mainstream narrative. Now, without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Judd Burton to the show. I've been looking forward to having you on the show for a while, and I'm excited to dive into your research and your insights. So it's an honor to have you here. So thank you so much for joining me. Really.
I'm happy to do it.
Oh, thank you. Your work has always fascinated me, and I'm sure our listeners are eager to learn more about your work as well. Could you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to write The Interview with the Giant? I love that book. It's really good.
Thank you. Well, I am a historian and anthropologist by training. I did my graduate work in anthropology and archaeology at Texas Tech University. So I have training across the cultural side of anthropology, archaeology, ethnology, and linguistics. My doctoral work was at the same institution, and I ended up writing a dissertation on Paneas, which is Caesarea Philippi in the New Testament, which is a site that I helped to excavate in previous years. So I maintain an interest in the site, and sort of reopened it during my dissertation phase. And I taught at colleges and universities for 20 plus years, and felt God calling me to devote my research time and in fact my teaching time to the this idea that had sort of been blossoming for really since my graduate school days, the Institute of Biblical Anthropology that I teach all my classes through now. But the story behind Interview with the Giant, my interest in these topics is really kind of long-standing. I grew up in a Christian home, and the Bible and learning sort of went hand in hand with my family, particularly under the auspices of my maternal grandmother's watchful eye. She was the librarian of the town that I grew up in, Merkel. And so that was my babysitting after school. A lot of time was spending those afternoons in the library. And so I developed an interest in the human past, specifically looking at it through a biblical lens pretty early on. And because my grandmother and my great aunt were all students, not only students of the Bible, but students of prophecy, I was always sort of looking at things through the supernatural lens anyway. So history and religion and mythology were high watermarks in terms of my interests from an early age. And I was always interested in the interplay between history and mythology, because as a culture, Western society has sort of inherited the sharp demarcation between history and mythology, which is really kind of epiphenomenal of the Enlightenment influence from the 18th century. But the fact of the matter is, the farther back in time you go, the blurrier that line is between history and mythology. And in fact, there are any number of examples that prove that mythology contains at least a nugget of truth in most cases. We've sort of butchered that word in Western languages in particular, and sort of gotten away from the Greek root mythos, which just literally just means story, but we've turned it into a synonym for a fable or a fallacy, which it's not. And so I became interested in these things fairly early on. But the story behind Interview with the Giant in particular stems from my dissertation work on Paneas, which is at the foot of Mount Hermon. And I'm sure your audience will be familiar with the Genesis 6 material and the accompanying Enoch material about the incursion of the Watchers on Mount Hermon. The fact of the matter is that as I did my dissertation research, I kept running across these questions that I didn't really, I thought they were valuable, so I would write them down. I would write little culture sketches on, towards answering those questions. And I've sort of joked in the past that the Interview with the Giant is sort of the residue of my dissertation, because I was sort of writing it while I was writing my dissertation, as if I wasn't busy enough to begin with doing the dissertation work. I had this collection of essays that was piling up on my desk. And that's the book that eventually became Interview with the Giant. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's a little bit about my background and how I became interested in the topics that people have come to follow me for.
Yeah. You mentioned ethnohistory. What is ethnohistory, and how does that, how does that help us to understand the content of the Nephilim and the Watchers?
Sure. Well, ethnohistory is a methodological tool that anthropologists have employed for decades now. Um, as an addendum to my previous comments, one of the things that influenced me in grad school was the utilization of anthropology to glean historical data. And I'd seen largely ancient and classical historians do this. People like Moses Finley wrote a book called The World of Odysseus, in which he used anthropology to look at the Homeric epics in the Homeric world. Ward Fowler was another guy who did kind of the same thing with Roman religion and Roman mythology. But I really didn't see, particularly with regard to the Watchers and the Giants, which were a matter of no small debate for biblical scholars and historians. I thought that it would be valuable to apply that kind of methodology to the problem of giants. And so that's where ethnohistory came into the picture. Ethnohistory is kind of a salvage history. It's a method that anthropologists typically have used to recover or build rather a culture narrative or culture history on a society that's either disappeared or is on the verge of disappearing. And so every possible bit of cultural minutia, whether it's folklore or genealogy or music or oral tradition or art, maps, just basically everything that can be salvaged is used to build this culture narrative. And so that's really kind of the main methodological aim that I had in putting the book together. But ethnohistory is as I pointed out, it's a tool that's been used by anthropologists really since the 60s and the 70s to recover as much as possible about either a race or rather a culture that's recently disappeared or one that's on the verge of disappearing.
Interesting. You also wrote about the pact between Watchers and human females. And, that's something I recently heard about from actually Tim Alberino. I went to the Costa Rica, the Blurry Creatures with your buddies,
sure.
Your buddies.
My
The
buddies,
Blurry, yes.
Yeah,
Yes. So I went to their conference that they had in Costa Rica this past, I guess earlier this year. And Tim talked about that. And that's the first time I heard about this pact between the Watchers and human females and I guess their fathers. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Certainly. Well, implicit in that in general is the pact that they made with humanity, this exchange of occult and practical sciences for genetic access to females. In the apocryphal literature, the fate of those women is basically describes them as becoming sirens. The there's a chapter in the updated version of Interview with the Giant called The Primal Witch that explicates this a little bit, but in essence, they were amongst the first witches. And the siren is a mythological typology that's pretty common throughout the Mediterranean and the ancient Near Eastern world, and even globally, you could say that they're analogs to the sirens, but typically they have talon-like. Something happened that changed these women, not just spiritually, but also to a degree physically. So there's something preternatural happening because you've got both a supernatural and a physical transformation. But the sirens are often described as having bird-like talons for feet. In some cases, they have wings. In other cases, they don't. In some instances, they're described almost as kind of mermaid. So there seem to be varieties of them, but the avian variation seems to be the more common one. The imagery that we have of Lilith, the Lilu or Lilitu in Mesopotamian mythology, is very reminiscent of that. The Strix in Roman mythology and the Lamia in Greek mythology would all be variations on this theme. But clearly there was a blood pact that was made, and of course, how is this relevant and pertinent for believers today? Well, this is sort of the not to use a pun, but the genesis of that part of the fall, and it forms the context for people learning this sort of knowledge, the witchcraft, if you will, or any number of appellations that we can give to it, but that's basically what it is. And it comes from the direct tutelage from one of these fallen Elohim. In the case of the pre-flood world, that would be the Watchers and the first generation of giants, the Nephilim, and then the spirits of those disembodied Nephilim in the post-flood world. So the blood oath, the pact, becomes such a key element of that, and you see it in later magical traditions, and in fact the polytheistic religions of the world. There were many of them, particularly early on, even if they lost the practice, many of them literally had blood at the center of their ritual practice, and that often involves blood sacrifice from humans. Now, that could be non-lethal. There are certainly examples of this the world over of bloodletting as blood sacrifice, but not infrequently it was actually the practice of human sacrifice, whether that was the dispatchment of adult supplicants or children, which unfortunately continues to this day, although under a sort of naturalized facade.
In like abortions?
Boy, yes, exactly. I mean, all you have to do is look at the statistics, and it's very clear that the cult of Moloch is still very, very much alive in that particular incarnation.
Yeah. So did these Nephilim or giants or fallen angels, did they make a blood pact with the humans for specific technology and knowledge, maybe? Is that what it is?
That has to be what it is. What's interesting about as far as I'm concerned, the timing of the arrival of the Watchers, I'm always trying to see what's possible in terms of lining the biblical timeline up with what I've learned in my own training. Um, um, but it seems to me that the likely time for the arrival of the Watchers would have been in the Epipaleolithic, which is towards the end of the Paleolithic period, going into the Mesolithic period. What's interesting about this time now, so we're talking between 15,000 and 12,000 BC. What's interesting about this time now is that archaeologically, we're having to rewrite history, although it's a slow process, a slow transition. We're having to acknowledge that civilization, that is city-state building, and that type of social organization, happened thousands of years earlier than the Sumerians or the Egyptians or even the Indus River Valley civilization, the Harappans, which all emerged in the fourth millennium BC. We now know with earlier sites, and this is not antediluvian speculation, this is based on archaeological data from numerous sites. We know from places like Tel es Sultan, which is prehistoric Jericho in Israel. That phase of the site dates back to the mid 10th millennium BC, and was clearly a city at that time. We know that because of the watchtowers and the layout of the city that were excavated. They were growing grain outside the city walls. Other Natufian sites in the region, like Tel Caramel in Syria, and of course the groundbreaking discovery of sites like Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, and even places like Chateau Hayek, all belie this kind of social organization at the city-state level. Before this, virtually all of humanity were hunter-gatherers and horticulturalists of one sort or another. And so there's a 90-degree angle change in the cultural trajectory of humanity at this time. Typically, the only time that happens is when a culture or society is acted upon drastically from now I'm just talking about human history. The only time that you see those kinds of abrupt changes, irreparable changes, are when one society is acted upon another society that is typically technologically more advanced, and oftentimes epidemiologically outfitted to weather more diseases than the people that they come into contact with. And I'll speak to this in just a moment, but your question was there a specific set of skills that were taught by the Watchers? I think this is explicated fairly well in First Enoch, where basically each of the Watchers specializes in a task, whether that's something natural like charting the movements of the stars, or the weather, or something occult like witchcraft or enchantments, those sorts of things. There's that combination, but what in general what they taught were the rudiments of what we would call civilization, the city-state dwelling, the transition from nomadic and semi-nomadic lifestyle to a more sedentary lifestyle, speaking in terms of social organization. So the emergence of what we would call cities coincides with what I believe the timing of the arrival of the Watchers and the beginning of that first generation of Nephilim in the pre-flood world. The other thing that makes me think that this is timed with the Mesolithic Neolithic revolution, which is what archaeologists have typically called this transition. Although we know far more about it archaeologically than we do when that title was first given by the archaeologist Veer Gordon Childs. But there are events in the geological history of the planet that occur that made me think that this is the timing, because not just the Bible, but epics from around the world and oral traditions from around the world all speak of a great deluge or flood that came because of the wickedness that was on the earth. And just quantitatively, that's probably one of the more common near perennial myths in the world is the flood epic. There's a period, a geological period set within all of this called the Younger Dryas, which was hallmarked by all kinds of cataclysmic events. There were lots of weird things taking place just from a scientific, purely natural perspective. There are these huge coronal mass ejections that are coming from the sun at this time. They're breaking through the Van Allen belts and our protective layers. We know this, and we know that there are such intensity in some places because archaeologists can actually recover the vitrified rock. It was so intense that it was actually melting rock on the surface of the planet in places. There's rock art from the period from around the world that record the patterns hitting the ionosphere. We just had this big burst, that had caused these brilliant, aurora borealis displays that reached as far south as Texas this time. I had some friends send me some pictures the other night. And so, but these bursts during the Younger Dryas were so intense that the patterns could be seen from the same latitudes around the world. We also know that there were periods of flash freezing and also heavy rainfall during this period as well. And you add all this to the rising sea levels from glacial melt, and you've got the recipe for a catastrophic flood that's happening piecemeal, literally around the world. And again, this is, as I said, this is something that made such a huge impact on humanity that it burned itself into our collective cultural memory. It coincides with Plato's account of the destruction of Atlantis as well, in Timaeus and Critias, where he talks about the 9,000 years before his forebear Solon, which would have been about 9600 BC, about the same time when you see the climax of all of these catastrophic events and the Younger Dryas. And I think what we're looking at here is the flood that's recorded in the Bible, and the destruction would have included the destruction of a lot of this pre-flood civilization, so that we only have remnants of it in places like Tel Carmel and prehistoric Jericho and Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe and Novoli Chari and a lot of those sites in southeastern Turkey in particular. So there's so much evidence that piles up on the geological side, on the archaeological side, and then when you add the biblical narrative, to my mind, these events all seem to make the most sense during this Mesolithic phase of human history, when these changes are taking place. As a footnote to that, I would add that one of the things that we can chart at this time also is the decrease in the population of megafauna that these peoples depended on for meat. The big elephantine creatures like the mammoth and the mastodon, but also not just food animals, but also predator animals like the short-faced bear in North America, dire wolves, these huge, quadrupedal species. Most scholars have historically written this off as being due to overhunting by human societies. And I think the overhunting hypothesis is a valid one, but I think it doesn't account for all of the agency. And I think when you factor in the caloric intake that would have been necessary to sustain the giants, these huge, ancient gigantic hominids, then that begins to take on a hue of reality as well. So there's actually a scientific hypothesis. I think it's called the unknown agent hypothesis, something to that effect. It says that we still really don't know those final factors that contributed to the demise of the megafaunal species. I think the Bible answers that question. I think it answers that question in the form of the bloodlust of the Nephilim. And again, just from a scientific perspective, the caloric intake that would have been necessary to sustain them. So there are a lot of things that are taking place at this time that we can observe archaeologically. But the change in the way that humans began to socially organize them and the skill set that they were utilizing is monumental in its shift, because for again, arguably millions of years we were hunter-gatherers and horticulturalists, and historically speaking, in the blink of an eye, now there's this new option. Now, there are certainly still peoples that were living nomadically and living a kind of Stone Age lifestyle, but this new city-based dwelling, and I note with some interest that the Hebrew word ir for watcher or angel can also mean city or dwelling place in Hebrew and Aramaic. Irim and Irene are those words, plural. So that connection between those two concepts is a long-standing one in the ancient Near Eastern mind, not by accident. I would posit. So yeah, there's definitely the specific skill set, and it has to come from this outside source. And I think we have to turn to the supernatural to find the answer to that question, because there aren't other human societies on the planet that could have caused that sort of change on another population. Jared Diamond wrote a really interesting book called Guns, Germs, and Steel back in the late 90s. I read it when I was in graduate school for the first time, but I really didn't begin to think about the sort of philosophy that he was applying to human history until I started to revisit the issue of the giants and the watchers and their impact on humanity. And Diamond is an interesting fellow. I met him at a conference once. He's not a believer that I know of. He's strictly an evolutionist. But what I think is valuable about this world history that he wrote is the way that he approached it. The climax of the story is the clash between the Spanish under Pizarro and the Inca under Atahualpa in Peru in the early 1500s. And he argues that there were things set in motion thousands of years before that event that set people up in the old world to be in a position to so drastically overpower and change peoples in the new world. And they stem from things like geography and epidemiology. What I mean by that is the continents in Europe and Asia, Eurasia, in other words, is one big continent. It's along from east to west. What that means is that these ideas that the Watchers planted, civilization and agriculture and metallurgy and things like that, had an easier route to travel from east to west. They had similar climates and landforms to go over. In the Americas, the continents are long north to south, which meant that you had a great variety of climate and landforms, basically everything that the planet has to offer for civilization to spread from. And so from Mesoamerica, where it emerges first, it has a very difficult time moving north and south. And it was much slower than in the old world. And so there were thousands of years of this adoption of technology and metallurgy and agriculture that built and built and built over the millennia in Eurasia. People in the old world were also raising herd animals like cattle and sheep and pigs and things like that. And so particularly with the bovine animals, they were exposed to diseases like anthrax and smallpox. And so there were populations that developed greater immunity for it. And of course, the plague, the Black Death in the 14th century, culled the human population a little bit so that you had the stronger people surviving. And then you had the technology of steel, a combination of iron and carbon and gunpowder and firearms that you add to that, and it becomes a recipe for disaster and extreme cultural change in the New World. So that these conditions were set up millennia before Pizarro and Atahualpa meet in Peru in the 1530s. So people in the New World didn't have herd animals. The closest thing they had were like, llamas and alpacas. So they were particularly hit hard by diseases like smallpox. Wiped out millions of people, did a lot of the work, and the military depredations of the Spanish, who were fresh off of running the Moors out of Spain at the time, were just militarily pugilistic and set on conquest. You add all of that together, and it's a recipe for not only disaster for peoples in the New World, but also irreparable cultural change, cultural damage.
Yeah.
What hit me about that, and why I think it's pertinent to this discussion of the Watchers and their influence on human culture is that those proximal issues that set the Spanish up, and by proxy, the French, the Dutch, the English, the big imperial powers, to have such a hold on the Americas and cause irreparable change to those cultures. As I said, the only source that you can look to for that level of change in the Mesolithic, Neolithic period, when I believe that the Watchers arrived in Earth. You can't look at other human populations because, as I said, most humans were hunter-gatherers. Some were horticulturalists, but mostly hunter-gatherers. The only place that you can look is to the supernatural for that degree of change. And I think the agency, the clearest agency, is that of the Watchers to begin with, and then their Nephilim progeny after that. So this is the cultural context for that skill set being bequeathed to humanity through this horrendous blood pact.
Interesting. Yeah. Younger Dryas you mentioned, isn't that like 10 to 12,000 years before, rather than the Bible thinks of 6,000 years ago, humans? It's like Graham Hancock.
Yeah. Hancock and Randall or Ronald Carlson, I think, done a lot of work towards that.
Yeah. Very
Dr.
interesting.
Dr. Robert Schock has also done some work in that area too.
Yep. Yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah. I mean, there are these, most of these guys are not willing to ascribe supernatural agency to the change. They're just looking at,
yeah, absolutely,
at human change. But the problem is, I've laid out the problem with that in our interview here today, is that there's no human agency that could have caused that level of change at the time. Even in looking at examples like the clash between the imperial powers in the 16th century and the New World, the Spanish and the native populations. Even the advantages that the Spanish had were still epiphenomenal of the influence of the Watchers. Agriculture, technology, city building, those concepts were seeded by the Watchers during that period.
Interesting. That's so cool. And you talked about this change in the atmosphere, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Ev Conkran, I don't know if you've heard of him. He talks about that as well. I think he just retired. He was a university scholar that talks about the change during that time, where the big changes that you said that happened in the sky, where people saw from all over the continent. And he talks about this with the drawings on the wall, things like that that they drew. So he talked about that. He has a book called The Case of the Turquoise Sun. He thinks that before, I guess, some kind of catastrophic thing that happened, the sun was actually like a turquoise or a purple color, not the color that it is now. But yeah, very interesting. Yes, very, very interesting. And also giants. It's weird how all over different continents they talk about giants. Japan has giants. They call them oni, and they actually eat humans. There's places in Japan that's like, my family is from the northern part of Japan, Hokkaido, and they have a place called Noboribetsu. It's an onsen, which is hot springs there.
Right.
So they have a town there called um, it's called Jikokudani, which is like a hell valley, because
Hmm.
it actually has the steams that's coming out of the volcano, and the ground there is soft in certain spots, and it bubbles. You can see it
Hmm.
bubbling, and it has that stench of
Like
sulfur.
sulfur. Hmm.
Yep. It's funny that they have this all across the world. Giants.
Yeah, that I mean, you're hard pressed to find a place
Hmm.
that doesn't have stories about giants. Yeah. Um, the the evidence, I'm asked frequently about evidence
Hmm.
for giants, and my response is always, what sort of evidence do you want? Because it's really sort of hiding in plain sight.
Yeah.
Really three axes of evidence. There's the mythological,
Hmm.
which is typically peripheralized by mainstream academia. And that, of course, is not just myths that are recorded in epics like Gilgamesh and the Egyptian stuff, but oral tradition. Um, you know, the we have this long-standing bias in the West about written versus oral tradition. Oral tradition, it's not as accurate as writing, or whatever. Yeah, but there are examples in oral tradition that are extremely accurate. The the Anasazi in the American Southwest were adept astronomers, and they transmitted their sciences orally so accurately that they could predict celestial events that wouldn't happen for 4 or 5 generations, and they did it so well that when those later generations emerged, they knew exactly where and when to look for those things. The ancient Hebrews were an oral tradition long before they even developed writing, and had the kind of scribal redundancies that developed in their written culture were residues of their oral culture. Um, the the Druids in the British Isles had to memorize thousands upon thousands of these 3-line strains. So the oral tradition requires a different kind of mind. Your mind gets wired in a different way, so that memorization is just sort of second nature. So there are plenty of examples of oral tradition being thoroughly accurate. The second axis of evidence would be historical, those based on written records and documents. You certainly have accounts from that going back to antiquity. Now, admittedly, the third axis, the material evidence, what we might call archaeological or artifactual evidence, is probably the sparsest, but it does exist. Um, our fossil record is replete with gigantic hominids that we're still trying to. We think that the science is settled on the taxonomy of these things. Well, it's not, because a lot of a lot of those finds are those paleoanthropological finds are fragmentary. We don't have complete skeletons for those things. Um, Certainly, we have the remnants of the influence of giant culture on humanity and our monuments and things like that. So, um, yeah, the evidence is all over the world. Um, people just people just need to put aside, in many cases, some of their preconceived notions about things like myth and oral tradition, um, and know that the way that history is supposed to work is that when better evidence comes along and and either augments or or changes the narrative, then that should decide and define where that narrative goes. But unfortunately, that's not how it works in the world. It's science by consensus these
Yep.
days. But
And
you're
this,
you're you're exactly right. Whether you're talking about East Asia, Central Asia, Southern Asia, Europe, Africa, the Americas. There's not a place you could go in the world that doesn't have some tradition about giants.
Yeah, it's incredible. They even name places in Japan,
Hmm.
that's something to do with giants or demons or devil,
Certainly.
hell, things like that. That's got to make you think. Um, you had also mentioned the first vampires were
Hmm.
Nephilims and they drank
Hmm.
blood. I guess because they're more cannibalistic or they became cannibalistic.
Sure.
And you mentioned that there's something special about the blood. In fact, the Bible speaks of against drinking blood, and we're supposed to
Sure.
drain the blood of the
Hmm.
animals before we eat it.
Yeah. The Levitical prescription of the blood is the life. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Vampirism, like so many occurrences of folkloric, what we might call folkloric monsters or folkloric creatures, also has its origins in the pre-flood world. And um, I I had not considered that until I started. I was taking a medieval history class, my first upper level history class at Hardin Simmons University, and I decided to write my paper on medieval vampirism. So sort of outside the scope of what we're talking about now in terms of origins, but uh, the first book that I consulted was Montague Summers' The Vampire as Kith and Kin, which is an excellent, worthwhile volume I would recommend to people. But Summers was really the first person to connect vampires to the pre-flood world. And his prefatory remarks, it's just a few sentences, but he makes a clear connection with the account in Enoch, specifically the judgment that's handed down to um, the Nephilim. Now, again, from those same accounts, we know that they were bloodthirsty, that they cons- they consumed the resources of humanity, and then they began to kill humans themselves and eat them and drink their blood. They even turned on themselves and warred against each other and practiced cannibalism. So those vampiric qualities were definitely already there when they were in physical form. And when they're stripped of their bodies in the flood, the judgment that's handed down to them is that there'll be evil spirits, unclean spirits on the earth, and that they would hamper humanity and always be thirsting and hungry, but never able to sate their physical desires. Um, and it's this passage that Summers connected to the origins of the vampire. So, from a biblical perspective, um, that should be cause for raised eyebrows. That we're being given the demonic roots of vampirism right there. Uh, and again, that word vampire is very, it carries a lot of baggage with it, and usually we think of the cinematic or literary vampire. Um, the suave European nobleman, plastic fangs, and you really to understand the vampire, Christians need to strip the cinematic veneer from the vampire. Take the Hollywood out of it, take the Twilight and the True Blood, and you have to take all that, even the Victorian stuff like Polidori's The Vampire and the novel Dracula. To an extent, you have to strip that stuff away to understand the demonic roots of the vampire, and that its occurrence in reality is evinced by these experiences that are recorded in people's folklore um, and written records in many instances. And even the Bible makes reference to vampirism, which in and of itself is a terrible parody of what Christ offers. Christ offers a real eternal life. Christ offers um, he offers his blood as a sacrifice. Um, the vampiric spirit takes
Takes.
blood. It offers a counterfeit immortality, as does the entire demonic realm. Um, so, getting back to biblical references, actually references in canon scripture, Isaiah chapter 34 makes reference to the Lilith, who was a night demon that drank the blood and ate the flesh of children. She's referenced not only there but also in the Psalms in a number of places. The other vampire that's specifically referenced in the Bible is the Aluka in Proverbs 31, which is generally translated as horse leech. But the Aluka was actually a shape-shifting vampire in ancient Near Eastern tradition. That morpheme that it comes from, the middle part there, look, which would be LK because there were no vowels in ancient Hebrew, is also to be found in one of the ethnic designations that's outlined in the Bible of the Amalekites. Amalek, who was a descendant of Esau, that LK is in that word. In fact, Amaleki means the blood drinkers or the blood lickers. And they're one of the first, actually, they are the first obstacle to the ancient Hebrews once they're re-entering Canaan to reconquer it. And there's a hefty judgment placed against the Amalekites, so that they're supposed to be destroyed down to the last man, woman, and child, all of their livestock, just completely, so that there's an ever war that's supposed to exist between the Hebrews and the Amalekites. So vampires do exist. Certainly we have a profusion of different kinds of vampires that occur in world lore, but they can all be traced back to the pre-flood world.
Wow. So you think that there's reason to believe that these creatures still exist today?
Oh, certainly. I mean, I think if you look at, well, I mean, it was just earlier this year there was an instance of vampirism that broke out in the Philippines. The Filipino lore has a kind of Lilith creature that's able to detach its upper torso from the rest of its body. And there were sightings of this creature earlier this year. And then, of course, you have people who are demonized themselves, who actually take part in ritual blood drinking. Some vampirologists call these people vampiroids. They're mimicking, but I think they're genuine vampires too, because there's a demonic influence there. And this sort of ritual blood drinking also takes place in the upper echelons of society, with all the things that are coming out about how, the Hollywood crowd and the consumption of adrenochrome, derived from child sacrifice, whether it's actual child sacrifice or, from the abortion industry. That is a kind of vampirism. So yeah, to answer your question, yes, it's still very much a part of the world today, but people typically don't want to classify it as such, much less, give it the time of day and consider it.
So those people, they consume the blood because the blood is something special. Is that where your soul is? What's special about the blood?
There's a sacrality. The sacrality of blood is a human universal. I mean, virtually every culture understood this. The ancient Hebrews did, or they wouldn't have been directed to write so prolifically about it. And of course, its significance to believers is evident in the sacrifice that Christ made. But if you look at cultures, the acknowledgement that there's not that it's not just a natural substance. Yes, it naturally sustains life, but there's a supernatural component to blood. It's also a perennial feature of human culture. Um, the uh, the ancient Maya, who um, prolifically practiced human sacrifice. In fact, that was the main reason that Mayan city-states warred against each other, was to take captives to offer to their gods. They called blood the food of the gods. They believed that this actually sustained their gods. And of course, there are iterations of this all around the planet. So it was understood by prehistoric and ancient peoples as a given that blood was something other than just a natural substance, that it had these supernatural qualities to it.
Interesting. Um, the name of one watcher in particular seems to reoccur in your research, Azazel.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Was he some kind of chief of the fallen angels or something like that?
Yes, he was probably he's one of the chiefs of these cabals of watchers. Arguably, he was Semyaz's lieutenant. He was certainly, we know that Azazel is probably the most culpable of the Watcher Angels, because his punishment seems to be the most severe. He's described as being responsible for all sin. He's responsible for a great deal of corruption, so much so that his name is preserved in the atonement sacrifice in the Old Testament. We just got through celebrating Yom Kippur this weekend, so this is on a lot of people's minds at this point now. The Azazel goat, which was part of the sacrifice, was not actually a sacrifice to Azazel. This was just all of the sins of the tribe were put onto the goat and then either turned out into the wilderness, which was the haunt of demons in Hebrew ideology, or he was bound. The goat was bound, as Azazel was in the Book of Enoch, and then tossed over the edge of a cliff or a chasm. So yeah, it's not that they were worshiping Azazel, but the Azazel goat became the scapegoat for all the sin. Now, where that becomes pertinent for my research is in the continuation of the worship of Azazel, which I argue in not only Interview with the Giant and in my book Paneas, but in my dissertation, that the cult of Pan, the goat god Pan, for which Paneas gets its name, was simply a continuation of the reverence of Azazel and his incarnations in various goat gods, such as the Amorite and Babylonian deities that peopled the region, like Maru and the Assyrian Benu. Adzaga was another Amorite goat deity that was worshipped in the region. And of course, Odds and Uds and the Hebrew Sherim, which were the equivalent of the Greek satyrs. Consequently, which were mentioned in conjunction with Lilith in that passage in Isaiah that I was talking about. So it seems to me that there's a clear legacy from Azazel all the way down to arguably the present day, even though he's imprisoned. These watchers are still sort of have a measure of control, the same way that a crime lord that's been in prison is still controlling his drug empire from prison. But yeah, Azazel has been a central figure in my researches.
Is Azazel? He's not the Satan, is he? The Satan.
No,
It's like his right hand man, maybe.
yeah, well, yeah, that's at least he was the right hand of the Watcher Shemyaza, but because goats were typically associated with the left hand path, well, with the the satanic, um, and these hooved and horned creatures and deities, particularly in Europe, but really the world over, became a kind of easy analog for the imagery of Satan. And so the the satyrs of Greek mythology and the fauns of Roman mythology and um, the pucks in Celtic mythology and their analogs around the world. You know, Kokopelli in the American Southwest. They all became analogs for um, Satan in a way, and so that's where that goat imagery that's connected with him comes from.
Do we know Satan's name? It's not Azazel. Who is he?
Well, that is an excellent question. Satan, and this is a topic that we batted around on Iron and Myth before. Um, Satan in the Old Testament is a title. It's a legal position. Um, the accuser or the adversary. The Greek diabolos is used in the New Testament, which basically means the same thing. Uh, there's possibility that this is a rotating position, that Satan's seat, as it were, his throne on earth, moves from place to place depending on what geographical principality is in control. Um, if that's the case, at one time it was Babylon, at another time it was Rome during the time of Christ. Um, and so the possibility exists that there are different fallen Elohim that fill the same position. But Satan becomes such a solidified figure in the New Testament that the other possibility seems more probable, that it's been one entity since the beginning. In the end, I tend to go with it being a singular entity. So going all the way back to the Nakash, the serpent in the garden, is the entity that we're dealing with. But I'm not averse to the possibility. It's one of those questions that I'm looking forward to having answered in heaven. But I tend to think that it's one entity, but there is some linguistic and historical wiggle room to account for the possibility that it's a rotating title.
Interesting. I never heard that before.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, Derek Gilbert and Doug Van Dorn, Brian Godawa, and myself did an episode of Iron and Myth on that very topic.
Wow. Wow. I have to watch that one. That's pretty cool. So despite the loss of their physical bodies, the Nephilims, is there reason to believe that the giant spirit continues today?
There's ample reason. In fact, the ethnogenesis of demonic culture really begins again in the pre-flood world. If we're to look at the nature of Jesus's ministry and his interaction with demons, and the rate of occurrence of those encounters in in Upper Galilee and the Golan region of Israel, and taking into account the actual words that are used in the New Testament, one of them prolifically being unclean spirit, which is the same designation that's given to the spirits of the Nephilim, the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim. So I think this was understood by the Second Temple Jewish mind, that this was the origin of demons. They had angelic pedigree, but they were not the same thing as the fallen watchers, the fallen angels. Now they could be designated as Elohim, but again, as I pointed out on any number of shows, this is a taxonomy that we're still fleshing out right now. But the demons seem to be something very distinct from the fallen angels, the watchers. And I think that Jesus's ministry and the location of his ministry bears this out, because a lot of it is taking place, as I said, in the Golan Heights, in Galilee, in the old, right at the foot of Mount Hermon. He makes these statements at Caesarea Philippi at Peneus. But the villages of Galilee see a lot of his ministry, and a lot of his ministry is dealing with demons. But because they've, for lack of if you'll pardon the vernacular, they've hung around in that vicinity, trying to thwart all of the plans that God had for humanity, namely the arrival of the Messiah.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to keep you longer than I have to. I'm so sorry, but I know I've taken up a lot of your time, and I really appreciate it.
Happy to do it.
Where can people find you and your work and your books?
Probably the first place people can go is burtonbeyond.net. And you'll find links to the Institute of Biblical Anthropology there, and people can find, if they want to take courses with me, they can do that. There are also links to my bookstore there. People can follow me on Facebook. I'm on X. I'm on YouTube. I've got a Gab account, and I'm about to open a Rumble account too. And everybody wants me to do my own podcast, so I'm probably going to launch into that in the near future, in a kind of teaching format. I'll probably have some guests on from time to time, but mainly a teaching podcast. But in a nutshell, that's how people can find my work.
Awesome. Thank you again. Thank you so much, Dr. Judd Burton, for joining us today on this show. It's not every day that we can explore such ancient mysteries with someone who's dedicated so much of their life understanding the spiritual and historical origins of our world. So I really deeply appreciate your time and your passion that you bring to your research. Thank you again for being here. I hope I can have you back.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And that brings us to an end of another episode. I want to thank my special guest and friend, Dr. Judd Burton, for sharing his incredible knowledge and insights with us today. I hope you all enjoyed this deep dive into ancient history, spiritual warfare, and everything in between. If you loved this episode, please be sure to subscribe, review, and share it with your friends and loved ones. It really helps grow our ohana, and it keeps these amazing conversations going. And don't forget to check out the show notes for links to Dr. Judd Burton's work, as well as my latest blog on Amazon's top 10 skincare products for women and holiday gift ideas. Also head over to my website, sensiblehippie.com, where I cover all things alternative, spirituality, and more. If you're looking for exclusive content and early access to episodes, be sure to check out my Patreon, which should be running smoothly soon. Thanks again, guys, for tuning in, and until the next time, a hui ho! Bye!
Hey, what do you say? nothing to do. These days they come and go. Me and you, nothing to lose. I feel it in my soul. So let's let the good times roll. So let's let the good times roll. So let's let the good times roll.